This is a recording of Chapter 7, Part 2. We're going to focus on the biodiversity related to different zones of the water on Earth. Most of the Earth is covered with water. About 71% of the Earth's surface is covered with salty ocean water. Aquatic life zones are similar to biomes, but they are aquatic. So biomes are specifically on land, and aquatic life zones are related to water. Aquatic organisms are distributed based on the salinity of the water. And the salinity is the amount of various salts that are dissolved in the water. So that would be, for example, sodium chloride, which is salt that you would put on your food. So salinity brings us to the next part here. There are two different major types in the classification based on salinity. You have salt water, which is marine. So that's going to be oceans and bays, estuaries, and other coastal systems. And then you have your freshwater life zones like lakes, rivers, streams, and inland wetlands. And we have a classification of different aquatic organisms. We have plankton, nekton, benthos, and decomposers. And we will go through each of those in more detail. So here's plankton. So plankton are weakly swimming and free floating organisms. And usually they are microscopic or very, very tiny. And here are some images of some plankton. And there are two types of plankton. We have phytoplankton, which are photosynthesizers, and that includes many different types of algae. And then we have zooplankton, which are plankton that feed on other plankton. So the phytoplankton are producers and the zooplankton are consumers. Then we have nekton. Those are strong swimming consumers, such as fish, turtles, and whales. Benthos are bottom dwellers, for example, oysters, which anchor themselves to one spot. And then clams, some worms, and those are organisms that burrow into the bottom of the sea floor. Then we have lobsters and crabs which walk on the seafloor. And then we have decomposers, which are mostly bacteria, and they break down organic compounds in the dead bodies and wastes of other aquatic organisms. So what factors affect the type and number of organisms that live at different water depths? We have water temperature, dissolved oxygen content, the availability of food, the availability of nutrients, and light required for photosynthesis. And we'll get into some of these in a few minutes when we discuss the different depths within the ocean. You have different zones where different life exists. So first, we're going to talk about marine ecosystems, and then later we will talk about freshwater systems. So this is a diagram from the textbook. It shows the ecological services and the economic services of marine ecosystems. So you have food, pharmaceuticals, for example, omega-3 fatty acids that come from fish oil, harbors and transportation, recreation, oil, natural gas, minerals like sea salt, CO2 absorption, waste treatment, habitats and nursery areas, climate moderation. And we discussed that during the previous lecture where we talked about how the ocean water and the proximity to the ocean is going to be moderated by the ocean absorbing heat slowly and then releasing that heat slowly. So it moderates the climate of coastal regions. That is something we discussed in the previous lecture. You can refer back for more details on that. So when you're looking at the ocean, there are three major life zones. We have the coastal zone, the open sea, and then the bottom of the ocean. So the next slide illustrates the major life zones and the vertical zones in an ocean. The actual depths that are shown vary by location, and the available light determines what is the euphotic, bathyal, and abyssal zones. And then temperature zones also vary with depth, which is shown by the red line here. Okay, so that the red line is showing you the water temperature, and the y-axis here is showing you depth. So you start out with warmer temperatures, and then around 200 meters deep, that is where you have this dropping in temperature, and then around 500 meters, it drops. And then it's pretty cold throughout this zone down here. And this is your coastal zone. See, it says coastal zone here. And you have your high tide area, your low tide area. This is your estuary. Again, estuaries are where rivers meet the ocean. And this is pretty shallow area here. And then once you get past the continental shelf, which is right here, that's your open sea. And that's where you have your vertical zones based on light. So your euphotic zone is where photosynthesis occurs because you have enough light penetrating down to the bottom of the euphotic zone. In this diagram, it's about 200 meters. So you have photosynthesis with your plankton, and you have other animals that live in this area up here. So it's pretty productive compared to deeper, where you have less sunlight. So then you have the bathyal zone, which is your twilight zone. And yes, it is actually called the twilight zone. Okay, so you don't really have enough light for a lot of photosynthesis to happen. And then you go to your abyssal zone, which is darkness. And you have some fish and other organisms are able to produce light, and it's through using phosphorus. It's similar to how you have fireflies that fly around in the summer that light up. It's similar to that. So you have this fish here that has a little bit of a light. And if you saw Finding Nemo, they have a scene where they have a fish that has a light coming out of the top like that. And here are some more explanations. So again, the open ocean is where you have those three zones related to the amount of sunlight. The euphotic zone is brightly lit. You have lots of plankton that are using the process of photosynthesis to make their own food. Now, this process also helps remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So plankton are providing that natural service by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That is a process that is about 40% of the world's photosynthetic activity, actually. And then again, the bathyal zone, which is the twilight, it gets a little bit of sunlight, but it's not enough for the photosynthesizing producers. And then again, your lowest zone, which is deep, very cold, very dark. There is little dissolved oxygen. That is your abyssal zone. So going back to the coastal zone, which again is up here. The coastal zone is shallow and rich in nutrients. And it goes from the spot where high tide comes onto land down to the edge of the continental shelf. And the nutrients that are in that water area come from the land and they wash down into the coastal water. Many of the nutrients come from the weathering of rocks, as well as agricultural runoff like fertilizer or animal waste. Animal waste would be like manure, for example. Now, coastal zones are also susceptible to contamination from pollution from the land. So coastal areas have high net primary productivity, and that is due to the amount of sunlight that penetrates through the water and the nutrients that feed the plants that are in the coastal area. And those nutrients are mainly coming from the land. And then within the coastal zone, you have estuaries and coastal wetlands. Estuaries are where a river ends at the coast, and you have an environment where freshwater and salty water mix. It's called brackish water. So it's like salt water that got diluted. And the river water brings nutrients and pollutants from the land into the estuarine region. And this is an image of the Amazon estuary. So here's the Amazon River. And here is the ocean. So coastal wetlands are areas where the soil is covered with water most of the time, or all of the time, or part of the time. And in temperate areas, we call these coastal wetlands. And in tropical areas, we call the wetlands mangrove forests. And here is a link if you want to read more about wetlands. And here is a photo of the Meadowlands in New Jersey. This is a coastal wetland marsh habitat. And the Hackensack River ends here. And this is going to be considered an urban wetland. So it's accumulating pollution from upstream. And then you also have some marine sources of pollution. For example, if there was an oil spill coming from a barge, for example, that might accumulate in this marsh as well. And then here is a mangrove forest in Australia. So instead of grasses in a temperate zone's marshland, right, it's mainly grasses, small shrubs, a little bit. You have these mangroves, which are small trees, and they have these strong roots, and they are really tightly intertwined with each other. And this provides an area for storm absorption, meaning if there is a storm that hits this coast, the energy from the storm waves is going to be focused on the mangrove trees. So you may have some damage to the trees, but that breaks up and dissipates the energy from the storm waves and wind. And any flooding that might happen, the mangrove trees are just going to get flooded. And then the land behind the mangrove trees, where possibly you have buildings, is then not going to get the brunt of the storm energy. And the same thing with the marshland, but with the mangroves, you have these strong woody roots and the trees, which are absorbing the storm energy rather than grasses and softer plants, which can absorb the floodwaters, but it's not going to help dissipate the storm winds and the storm waves as efficiently as the mangrove woody material. Now, estuaries and coastal wetlands are some of the Earth's most productive ecosystems. For example, here is a blue crab. Here are some oysters. These are some organisms that live within the coastal wetland region and estuarian region. Then you have seagrass beds, which consist of plants that grow underwater in the shallow marine and estuarine areas along most continental coastlines. So here's your seagrass beds. And a main natural service that coastal zones provide is absorbing pollution and absorbing nutrients. And then another natural service that coastal areas provide would be the absorption of storm energy, as I explained a couple of minutes ago. So in this case, we have organisms called filter feeders. Filter feeders, for example, oysters, but also grasses, help maintain the water quality by filtering or absorbing substances from the water. So grasses will help remove toxins, and then the toxins accumulate in the grass tissue. And oysters are doing the same thing. They're filtering the water. That's how they get nutrients. But along with the nutrients, they are taking in pollution. But these processes help to clean the water. Okay, so I just changed this. So say filter feeders and marsh grasses over here. Estuaries and coastal wetlands also provide food and habitats and nursery sites for a variety of aquatic species as well as terrestrial species. A nursery site means it's an area where animals lay their eggs. So fish, amphibians, and birds like to lay their eggs in estuaries and coastal wetland areas. And then again, the storm damage the absorption of the wave energy and the storing of excess water related to storm surge, as well as the precipitation. And that helps protect land and buildings and civilization that's further inland. Now, storm surge is when you have the wind related to a storm that pushes water onto the land. So that is going to cause massive amounts of flooding. Oysters are definitely understood and they are appreciated for their ability to clear water and improve water quality. So in the summer of 2011, the oyster larvae, here were some oyster larvae. They were deposited into Delaware Bay in order to restore oyster beds. And the oyster beds were then going to help to restore an ecosystem disturbed by an oil spill. And then the oyster beds also provide a substrate, a hard substrate, like a reef, and that allows other organisms to live around and on the oyster bed. For example, crabs and snails. And that brings us to coral reefs. Many organisms live around and on coral reefs. And this picture here shows you what coral polyps actually look like. So they got these tentacles sticking out. And there's vast amounts of biodiversity found within a coral reef habitat. So coral reefs are structures built by colonies of coral. So coral like to live together. There are some varieties of coral that do not, but most corals are going to live together as a colony. And each coral secretes the mineral calcium carbonate that makes their skeleton. It's the same material that clamshells and limestone rocks are made of. And they secrete this material, it makes their skeleton. And then when the coral dies, it leaves behind the limestone skeleton. So ancient coral reefs are going to be massive limestone areas, like this huge rock, for example, would be ancient coral reefs. So that's around the world, that's one source of limestone rocks is ancient coral reefs. So corals live in shallow, clear, warm coastal waters in the tropical and subtropical areas. And this is kind of an overhead view of a coral reef. And here's a close-up. And here is a list of ecological services provided by coral reefs. So corals provide a habitat for about 25% of all marine organisms. They act as a natural barrier to help protect the world's coastlines from erosion related to waves and storms. That's about 15% of the world's coastlines. They produce about 10% of the global fish catch. That means in terms of an industry where you're going to catch fish, about 10% of the global fish that are caught from within a coral reef habitat. They also provide fishing and ecotourism, for example, snorkeling. And this provides jobs for some of the world's poorest countries. Now, there is a situation that could happen to corals, and it's called coral bleaching. And we will go through the details. So there is a mutualistic relationship between coral polyps and single-celled algae called zooxanthellae. And those algae live within the tissues of the coral polyps. And the mutualistic relationship includes that the algae is provided with shelter because it's living within the coral tissue. And then the waste products from the coral are used as nutrients for photosynthesis. And then the corals, in turn, receive energy in the form of sugars as products of the algae's photosynthesis. And this relationship has allowed for corals to grow successfully in tropical waters that usually lack nutrients and food. Coral reefs can be easily damaged because they grow slowly and they are disrupted easily and require specific water conditions. For example, specific pH levels. They are also sensitive to things like pollution. And the problem with coral bleaching occurs when stresses such as increased temperature or a change in pH can cause the zooxanthellae to die and or leave the coral tissues. And then without the nutrients they provide, the coral polyps can die, and that leaves behind a white skeleton of calcium carbonate or limestone. So on the left is a healthy coral reef, and on the right is a bleached coral reef. And here again, on the left is a living coral, and on the right, it's a bleached coral. And here's a poster. You could read through the details. And coral bleaching can then end up disturbing the diversity of organisms that live around the coral reef. For example, damselfish on the left and cardinal fish on the right rely on living coral for protection from predators and strong currents. And those are just two examples. But there are many organisms that rely on a living coral reef habitat. Approximately 1/2 of the world's coral reefs have been destroyed or degraded by coastal development, pollution, overfishing, warmer ocean temperatures related to global climate change, as well as increasing ocean acidity, which we will talk about next. So we will talk about ocean acidification. The way that ocean acidification works is as carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, and that's mostly from humans burning fossil fuels, the oceans absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. So the ocean water is becoming more acidic. And shells and skeletons of many marine organisms, like snails, corals, oysters, clams, plankton, those shells are made of calcium carbonate, which is a mineral that dissolves when it comes in contact with acid. So the ocean acidification can harm these organisms because their shells are made of a material that dissolves in acid. It has been proposed that the only way to lessen ocean acidification is to have a sharp reduction in the use of fossil fuels around the world that in turn lessens the inputs of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then that would lessen the amount of CO2 that would be absorbed by the oceans. So basically, we should be reducing the amount of fossil fuels that we use and burn around the world. So now we're going to get into more information about human activities and how human activities are disrupting and degrading marine ecosystems. About 45% of the world's population and more than half of the US population lives along or near the coast. And this is related to major threats to the marine environment. And that's going to include coastal development, which destroys and pollutes various coastal habitats, runoff from non-point source pollution, such as fertilizers and pesticides, and point source pollution, such as sewage from passenger cruise ships and spills from oil tankers. Overfishing, which depletes populations of commercial fish. Use of trawler fishing boats, which is basically a fishing boat that drags a large net along the ocean bottom, and it disrupts the seafloor, and it picks up a lot of whatever is living on the seafloor. It breaks up everything that's down there, basically. Just you're dragging this huge net along the seafloor. So that's pretty disruptive. Invasive species, for example, fish that may have been introduced by humans into a marine ecosystem, perhaps through fishing, like farm fish. If you have nets offshore where you're farming fish, if any of those fish escape, then you are like introducing invasive species of fish. Some of them can outcompete populations of the native aquatic species. Climate change, for example, warming the oceans, leading to sea level rise, and then the ocean acidification that I just discussed. And this is a list of marine ecosystems and coral reef impacts and causes of degradation. You could read through that. And here is a photo of the coast of Tanzania, and it serves as a public waste dump. So people are just leaving their garbage along the coast there. And then you have degradation by directly building right on the coastline. So this is an example from Tiburon, California, where you have these very large, expensive homes built directly on the coast. So that interrupts the habitats of the coastline, and it also introduces pollution from runoff. Now we will talk about freshwater systems. Freshwater life zones include standing bodies of freshwater, like lakes, ponds, and inland wetlands, and flowing freshwater, such as rivers. And here is a diagram that shows the ecological services and the economic services of freshwater systems. You could read through that. So a watershed or a drainage basin is all of the area of land where all of the water that hits that land through precipitation or all of the groundwater ultimately reaches a particular stream or a particular lake. And in this case, you have a drainage basin or a watershed outlined in red. And in the middle of the red is a lighter colored green. So this diagram is showing that all of the land within the red line all ultimately flows into the Lotru River. So you have a river that is a tributary of the Lotru River. So just to clarify for a second, the watershed here is the watershed of the Latarita River, or the drainage basin of the Latarita River, which is a tributary of the Lotru River. Okay, so it is the drainage basin of the Latarita River, which means that any rain or snow, all the groundwater, everything within this red zone ultimately ends up in the Latarita River. But this river is a tributary of the Lotru River, which then ultimately gets all of the water from the Latarita River. So you have smaller drainage basins that feed into larger drainage basins of other rivers. And it's important to know what watershed you're within, because you know where all the pollution is going to end up. So all of the runoff from all of these areas of land, all of that runoff ultimately may end up in the Latarita River and then possibly be transferred to the Lotru River, because this river is a tributary of the Lotru River. And then we have inland wetlands. That's land that's covered with fresh water all or part of the time. These wetlands are located away from coastal areas, so these are inland wetlands, as opposed to the coastal wetlands that we talked about earlier. So these are going to be completely freshwater based. They're not going to be including any salt, no brackish water. This is just freshwater. Examples of inland wetlands include marshes, which are mainly grasses, reeds, and a few trees. Swamps, which are dominated by trees and shrubs. Floodplains, which receive excess water during heavy rains and floods. And then you have seasonal wetlands, which remain underwater or are soggy for only a short time each year. For example, the Arctic tundra is wet during the summer and frozen during the winter. So inland wetlands provide natural services, which include filtering and degrading toxic waste and pollutants. Again, some marsh grasses can do this, where they absorb the pollutants. Inland wetlands reduce flooding and erosion by absorbing storm water and releasing it slowly. And they also absorb overflow water from streams and lakes. So it's just an area that's able to take in extra water. So we like inland wetlands because if there were none, then you would have communities getting more flooded. Right? If you take an area that used to be an inland wetland, or it is an inland wetland now, if you transform that into a community with homes, then that area is going to flood. So you want to keep the inland wetlands intact so those areas can flood naturally instead of a community with homes and other buildings. Inland wetlands also help recharge groundwater aquifers. They also help to maintain biodiversity by providing habitats for many species like birds, amphibians, and fish. They supply products such as fish and shellfish and blueberries and cranberries and wild rice, as well as providing recreation for bird watchers, nature photographers, boaters, anglers, and waterfowl hunters. And then we're going to move on to another human activity that disrupts freshwater systems, and that is the building of dams. A dam is built to block river water, and it is used to create a reservoir, which is a man-made lake behind the dam. So here is the Hoover Dam, and behind the dam is this reservoir. So it's a man-made lake, and it could be used as a water supply for fresh water for many communities. And some dams do allow some water to pass through the other side. And some dams use hydroelectric methods to harness electricity, so that you're using running water to make electricity. So dams alter the habitat of the river. It reduces water flow. So ultimately, when you get to the coast, you don't have a lot of water that would otherwise be coming from the river. You don't have that river water ending at the coast any longer. So it affects estuaries. Also, it affects migrating fish because the fish can't migrate if there's a dam there. That problem can be mitigated with fish ladders and fish canyons, which I have a couple of videos in a minute that you could watch. And thirdly, a dam will prevent sand and silt from being transported to beaches and other coastal areas. And then those coastal areas experience erosion, which is natural from waves, but the sediment is not being replenished. Naturally, the river water would be carrying sediments to the coast and replenishing whatever is eroded from the coastline through waves and other processes. So you lose sand, and this is actually a really major problem in California beaches, where they don't have a lot of sand replenishment because there were a lot of dams along rivers that move westward toward the California coast. Here are two links that you could watch these videos. One is on fish ladders and the other one is on fish cannons. And also, flood control levees and dikes that are built along rivers disconnect the rivers from their floodplains. Basically, these are barriers that are built along rivers so that if there is a flood, the water is not ending up in the natural floodplain area. And that can destroy aquatic habitats and reduce or block completely the water from reaching nearby wetlands. Many inland wetlands have been drained or filled in order to use that land to grow crops, or the land has been covered with concrete, asphalt, and then buildings were built there. This is a major issue with flooding because these inland wetlands are naturally areas that flood. More than 50% of the inland wetlands in the continental US have been lost, which has increased flood damage in the US. Again, these inland wetlands are areas that are naturally going to flood if there's a storm with a lot of rain. Local rivers might end up having the floodwater end up in these inland wetland regions. Again, some of that is related to being in the floodplains of rivers. And if you make a community there by covering it up with buildings and concrete, you have the really significant chance of having those communities suffer major flooding. For example, Houston, Texas. 88 square miles of wetlands were lost in Houston since the 1940s because of urban development. And then in 2017, Hurricane Harvey happened, and there was a significant amount of flooding in Houston. And it was exacerbated because the area used to be wetlands, and now it is paved and a whole developed urban area. So the stormwater had nowhere to go but flood parts of the city because that was the natural flood zone. Many times flood areas, like these flood zones where you have wetlands naturally, sometimes it's because it's a lower lying area. So the water is going to prefer to end up in those areas, for example. So that's one reason why flooding may continue after you develop a wetland region. Okay, and then I'd like to show this video.
Residents within a mile and a half of the Arkema chemical plant have been told to stay away from their homes. The plant was swamped by 6 feet of water and lost all refrigeration. The chief executive says he expects dangerous chemicals known as organic peroxides to catch fire or explode, and the company has no way to prevent it. So why was Harvey so devastating to Houston? Some experts tell us the Gulf of Mexico is as much as 7 degrees warmer than average. Warm water fuels hurricanes, but that's not the only factor. Here's Manuel Bajorquez.
Harvey dumped a year's worth of rain on Houston in a matter of days, shattering last year's above normal rainfall and bringing this year's total to an unprecedented 73 inches.
Was this just a natural disaster?
No, this was a climate-influenced storm. There's no question.
Jim Blackburn of Rice University has studied the effects of storms on cities for nearly 40 years. He says when Harvey came ashore, the storm laid bare another problem decades in the making, the massive paving over of the area's natural wetlands and prairies.
We've covered our sponge up. The sponge that we had here was wonderful. It would hold water, but in order to develop it, you had to drain it. You had to get rid of the water. And as we've developed out, we've dumped water back on ourselves.
Since the 1940s, more than 88 square miles of wetlands have disappeared in the Houston area due to development. and the region's system of canals and bayous are overwhelmed by increasingly heavy storms.
Basically, Harvey is the new norm.
Blackburn says a photo of nursing home residents in waist-deep floodwater illustrates the problem. They were rescued, but it was built directly across from a floodplain boundary.
And part of it is either getting an adequate amount of room for that water to come through the city, which means buyouts, evacuation, and sort of green space and
So not rebuilding in some areas.
not rebuilding in some areas.
Andy says moving past a politically charged debate in a way many can understand. It's not just about the environment, it's about money.
Houston's economy has been disrupted. We're going to have a hard time recovering, and we're going to wear the brand of having this on us. This is what the climate scientists have been telling us would happen.
It's a game changer.
Yeah, well, absolutely, it's a game changer.
This road leads to a neighborhood where hundreds of homes are still flooded. It's one Blackburn would argue against rebuilding because it's near a reservoir where water had to be released to prevent the dam from failing. DeMarco?
Manuel Bajorquez reporting. Many, thank you.
Some people.
Okay, I think I got a couple of seconds of an ad in there in the video. Okay, and then here is a photo of some of the flooding from Hurricane Harvey. And then some further issues related to human activities disrupting and degrading freshwater systems include cities and farms adding pollution to nearby waterways. Farms are especially problematic because fertilizer runs off from the farmland and can end up in local streams, estuaries, and lakes. And the extra nutrients from the fertilizer and also manure, like animal wastes that come from farms as well, those are all extra nutrients that when they end up in a local waterway, those plant nutrients feed the photosynthetic algae and cyanobacteria that live in lakes, for example, ponds as well. And because you're fertilizing lakes, it can lead to a massive increase in the algae populations, and then that can have severe consequences. And that brings us to the term eutrophication. So eutrophication is when a shallow lake, estuary, or a slow-moving stream becomes enriched in nutrients. So eutrophic is well-nourished, and oligotrophic is poorly nourished. So eutrophic lakes have a large supply of nutrients that are needed by producers, for example, fertilizer and phosphates in detergents, and that can cause the lake to have a lot of growth of algae and other plants, different plants, and it becomes highly productive, and the lake can look murky, could be brown or green. And the poorly nourished lakes have a small supply of plant nutrients, so the water there is going to look crystal clear because you're not going to end up with an overgrowth of algae. So here on the left is an oligotrophic lake, so it's crystal clear. And on the right, that is a lake with an overgrowth of algae. Here's another lake with overgrowth of algae. Again, eutrophication occurs when fertilizer runoff or detergents that contain phosphates get into waterways from nearby urban and agricultural areas. Now, we could also add, with fertilizer, we could also add animal waste. Animal wastes. That would be like manure. And ultimately, eutrophication leads to many organisms dying from a lack of oxygen. Now, how does that happen? So let's go through that. Step one, the added nutrients cause explosions in the populations of algae and cyanobacteria, and those are photosynthetic organisms. When the algae and the cyanobacteria die, they are decomposed by bacteria. And this process uses oxygen. Those bacteria are aerobic bacteria. So they're using oxygen, and that process depletes the oxygen in the lake. So the lake's dissolved oxygen then decreases drastically if there is a significant overgrowth of algae in the lake. And then because you're losing your dissolved oxygen supply, fish and other species may die off. And that leads to a major loss in biodiversity. And that is a significant problem. So cultural eutrophication is when human activities are the source of the plant nutrients. So again, that could be nitrates and phosphates. And this is mainly from farmland or from urban runoff. Because eutrophication can be natural as well, but mostly we're discussing a cultural influence here from human activities. So again, the farmland, animal feedlots, fertilizer that people put on their lawns in suburban areas, that can also lead to runoff of nutrients into local waterways. Municipal wastewater treatment plants, that is where sewage from people's homes and different buildings ends up at a municipal wastewater treatment plant. And there can be materials that ends up in local waterways from the municipal wastewater treatment. And then the situation with phosphorus in detergents used to cause a significant eutrophication problem, but today in the United States, detergents are phosphate free because of the eutrophication that has happened related to detergents. So during hot weather or drought, the nutrient overload can lead to blooms of algae and cyanobacteria. So you're not ending up with a lot of precipitation that is diluting the nutrients in the water. You're concentrating the nutrients more, and that leads to algae blooms and thick growths of plants like duckweed and water hyacinth. And this leads to a reduction of sunlight because you have dense plant life, and you are reducing sunlight that can penetrate through the upper layers of the lake water. So that in itself is reducing lake productivity as well as fish growth, because fish are eating the phytoplankton. You were also lowering the oxygen content because of the decomposition of the algae once they die. And then that low oxygen in the lake can lead to fish dying and other aerobic aquatic animals, and we call that a fish kill. And then anaerobic bacteria can then take over and produce gaseous products such as hydrogen sulfide and flammable methane. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7, part 2.